There were men whose lives were shaped by the land, their days measured not by a clock on the wall, but by the slow crawl of the sun across a vast, unforgiving sky. Elias Thorne was such a man. His existence in the high country outside Millhaven, Colorado, had been pared down to the essentials. The work of his hands, the needs of his cattle, and the silence of a house that had grown too large for one person. He was 38 years old, but a quiet grief had settled into him 5 years prior, aging him in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with what time had taken away. Millhaven was a town of sturdy, practical people. It sat nestled in a valley, a last bastion of supplies and society before the land climbed into jagged peaks that scraped at the clouds. Its streets were wide enough for a wagon to turn, and its buildings were made of honest timber and stone, built to withstand the punishing winters and the searing summer sun. It was a place where a person's worth was judged by the straightness of their fence posts and the quality of their word. Elias had been a part of this town his entire life, yet he had become a ghost within it. He came in every Thursday for supplies, his face a stoic mask that revealed nothing of the man behind it. He spoke when spoken to, his voice a low rumble that was rarely used. The townsfolk knew his story. They knew about Martha, about the fever that had swept through and left him a widower. They had offered their condolences and their casseroles, and when he had politely but firmly retreated into himself, they had granted him the respectful distance he seemed to crave. His life had become a closed loop: ranch, cattle, town, ranch. He expected nothing more from it, because he had stopped believing there was anything more to be had. It was on a Thursday in late spring that the loop was first disrupted. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, the last of the snowmelt feeding the creeks that ran alongside the road into town. He was a mile out when the lurch and shudder of his wagon told him something was wrong. A moment later, the jarring crack of wood confirmed it. He climbed down, his movements economical and weary, to find the rear axle splintered, the wheel canted at a miserable angle. He swore, a quiet exhalation of breath that barely disturbed the air. It was a long walk back to his ranch for the tools and another wagon. He was assessing the damage, his mind already calculating the hours of lost work, when a voice cut through his thoughts. "That's a bad break." The voice was clear and low, without the lilt or flourish he associated with most women. He looked up and saw Beatrice Cole standing there. She had arrived in Millhaven about a year ago, taking up a position at the general store. She was a woman who, in a town of small, hardy folk, stood out. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, with a plain, serious face and hair the color of dark honey pulled back severely from her forehead. Most of the town didn't quite know what to make of her. She was not unfriendly, but she was not effusive. She did her work with a silent, startling competence and went home to the small house she rented at the edge of town. She did not gossip, did not flutter, did not seem to require the constant social churn that kept the town connected. She was simply there, an island of quiet capability. Elias had noted her presence in the same way he noted a new brand on a neighbor's steer, a fact, nothing more. "It is," he agreed, his gaze returning to the broken axle. He expected her to offer sympathy and move on. Instead, she looked at the fracture with a critical eye. "The wood's rotten through," she observed. "You'll need a new one." Not a repair. He knew this, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly from her was unexpected. Before he could respond, she spoke again. "Mr. Miller has a spare axle for this type of wagon behind his smithy. He owes me a favor. If you can get the wheel off, I can fetch it." Elias stared at her. It was the most direct and practical offer of help he had received from anyone in years. There was no pity in her eyes, only a shared understanding of a problem that needed solving. He found himself nodding. "I have a lever in the wagon bed," he said. She merely nodded back and, without another word, turned and began walking toward the town, her long strides eating up the ground with an unhurried grace. He watched her go, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It wasn't warmth, not yet. It was surprise. Pure, simple surprise. From that day forward, his Thursdays felt different. Before, the trip to town had been a chore, a necessary interruption. Now, it held a point of interest. He found himself watching Beatrice Cole as she worked behind the counter of Henderson's general store. He saw the way she stacked tins with an architect precision, the way she could hoist a 50-pound sack of flour without a grunt, the way her hands, which were long and capable, moved with a certainty that he, a man who worked with his hands all day, could appreciate. She was honest in a way that sometimes made other customers uncomfortable. When Widow Morrison complained about the price of sugar, Beatrice did not offer platitudes. She simply said, "The freight costs from the east have risen, ma'am. It is the same for everyone." The widow had huffed, but she had paid the price. When a young ranch hand tried to short his payment by a few cents, Beatrice had held his gaze, her expression unchanging, until he flushed and produced the correct coins from his pocket. She was not mean. She was merely factual. The world was as it was, and Beatrice Cole seemed to have no interest in pretending otherwise. Elias never spoke to her about anything beyond his order. "A sack of oats, please, Miss Cole. And a pound of coffee." She would gather his items, her movements efficient, and state the total. He would pay, she would thank him, and he would leave. Yet in these small, repeated interactions, a quiet awareness grew. He started noticing things. He noticed the way a stray piece of hair would sometimes escape her tight bun and curl against her neck. He noticed that her eyes, which he had first thought were just a plain brown, held flecks of gold in them when the afternoon light slanted through the store's dusty windows. He began to linger. He would check his list twice, 3 times, inventing a need for an item he had forgotten. He would stand by the pickle barrel, pretending to contemplate a purchase, while he simply observed her. He did not know why he did it. The feeling she evoked in him was not the familiar, fiery love he had known with Martha. It was a quiet, deep-running current of respect and admiration for her sheer, unadorned competence. It was a feeling that puzzled him, and so he did what he always did with things he did not understand. He watched them from a distance, turning them over and over in his mind. His friend, George Alcott, was the first to give voice to it. George was a man as weathered and blunt as the mountains themselves. They were sharing a beer at the saloon one Thursday evening, a rare indulgence for Elias. George took a long drink, wiped the foam from his mustache, and looked at Elias with eyes that missed very little. "You were in Henderson's for a full hour today," he stated. It was not a question. Elias shrugged, taking a slow sip of his own beer. "Had a long list." "Your list had 4 items on it," George countered, his voice dry. "I saw you write it out this morning. You've been staring at that tall storekeep for months now, Elias. A man would have to be blind not to see it." A dull heat rose in Elias's neck. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the worn wood of the table. "She's a capable woman. Helped me with a wagon axle once." George snorted. "Help you with an axle? Is that what we're calling it?" He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Martha's been gone 5 years. No one expects you to live like a monk forever. The woman is respectable. She's honest. And she doesn't seem to have the sense to be scared of you, which is more than I can say for most." Elias didn't respond. He finished his beer in silence, the weight of his friend's words settling uncomfortably in his gut. He was staring. He hadn't realized it was so obvious. He resolved to be more careful, to conduct his business and leave, to put an end to this foolishness. But he could not. The next Thursday, he found himself standing by the bolt of wool fabric, running his thumb over the rough texture, his eyes tracking her as she advised a young couple on the best type of canning jar. He was caught in a pattern of observation he seemed powerless to break. He told himself it was just curiosity about a person who did not fit the usual mold, but the excuse felt thin even to him. The catalyst for change arrived in the form of a man named Mr. Harris. He was a surveyor from Denver, hired to map the county lines. He was a handsome man, with an easy smile and clothes that were a little too fine for Millhaven. He was polite, educated, and it soon became clear that he had set his sights on Beatrice Cole. Elias saw it for the first time on a Sunday. He had made a rare trip into town for a piece of hardware he desperately needed, and he saw them walking out of the church together. Harris was talking, his head inclined toward her, a charming smile on his face. Beatrice was listening, her expression as placid as ever, but she was not walking away. She was walking with him. A week later, Elias saw Harris buy a small bouquet of wildflowers from a child on the street and present them to Beatrice at the store counter. She had taken them with a small, quiet nod of thanks, and for the first time, Elias thought he saw the barest hint of a smile touch her lips. Something cold and heavy settled in his stomach. It felt like dropping a stone into a deep well. The following Thursday, the feeling intensified. He conducted his business at the store with a clipped efficiency, avoiding her gaze. As he loaded his supplies into the wagon, he saw Harris waiting for her across the street. When she emerged from the store, locking the door behind her, Harris met her and offered her his arm. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. They began to walk down the street in the gold evening light, their figures silhouetted against the dust. Her tall frame was matched well by his. They looked to Elias's eye, right together. He stood by his wagon and watched them until they turned a corner and disappeared. The street suddenly felt empty. The air grew cold. He climbed into his wagon seat and drove the long road home, the familiar landscape feeling alien and desolate. He did not understand the profound ache in his chest. It was a hollow, painful thing, a sense of loss for something he had never possessed. He unhitched the horses, his movements automatic. He fed the livestock. He went inside his silent house. He did not light a lamp. He sat in his chair in the growing dark. The image of Beatrice and Mr. Harris walking together burned into his mind. He had told himself his feelings were just curiosity. He had told himself it was just respect for her capability. He had lied. The truth arrived with the force of a physical blow. It was the realization that the quiet center of his week, the one point of light in his gray routine, was the 10 minutes he spent in her presence. It was the understanding that the thought of her smile, however small, being directed at another man was not just unpleasant. It was intolerable. It was the cold, hard fact that he had, without intention or permission, come to care for this tall, serious woman. And he had done nothing. He had stood by his pickle barrel and watched. He had been so lost in the fog of his past, so convinced that his life story had already been written, that he had failed to see the new chapter waiting right in front of him. George's words came back to him. A man would have to be blind not to see it. He had been blind. He was a fool, a slow, grieving fool who was about to lose something precious before he had even worked up the courage to want it. The stillness in the room was absolute. For the first time in 5 years, the ghost of Martha did not feel like a constant companion, but like a gentle, fading memory. The grief was still there, a part of him, but it was no longer the whole of him. A new feeling was pushing up through the sorrow-hardened soil of his heart. It was a desperate, urgent need to act. He could not stand by and watch her walk away. He had to say something. Even if he was too late, he had to try. His entire understanding of his own life had just rearranged itself in the dark. The next week was the longest of his life. He worked himself to exhaustion, trying to outrun his own thoughts, but they followed him everywhere. He rehearsed speeches in his head while mending fences, his words clumsy and inadequate. He imagined her rejection, her polite but firm dismissal. He imagined her accepting Mr. Harris's proposal. Each scenario was a fresh torment. By the time Thursday arrived, he was hollowed out with anxiety, but his resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. He drove to town, his hands tight on the reins. He did not go to the general store. He couldn't. He couldn't face the mundane ritual of buying oats and coffee. Not today. He hitched his wagon and waded across the street, leaning against a post, feeling as exposed and nervous as a teenager. He watched the clock on the town hall creep toward 5. At 5 o'clock, the door to the store opened, and she emerged. She locked it behind her and turned, her gaze sweeping the street. Her eyes met his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, he pushed himself off the post and walked across the street to meet her. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his hat in his hands. He felt huge and awkward. "Miss Cole," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her own voice even and calm. She waited, her gaze steady and direct. She was not going to make this easy for him. He took a breath, The words he had practiced abandoning him. All that was left was the plain, unvarnished truth. "I've been a fool," he said, "and I'm slow. It takes me a long time to see things that are right in front of my face." He paused, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I saw you with Mr. Harris. He seems like a good man. And it made me realize what I was about to lose." He fumbled with his hat, his knuckles white. "I'm not a man of fancy words. I have a ranch, and I have my work. And for the past year, the best part of my week has been the few minutes I spend in your store. I am asking, Miss Cole, if you would allow me to come calling. If I'm not too late." She was silent for a long time. The sounds of the town, a distant hammer, the whinny of a horse, seemed to fade away. He could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. He had laid himself bare, and he braced for the impact of her refusal. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried a note of wry humor he had never heard before. "You got there," she said simply. He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Mom?" "You got there," she repeated. A small, genuine smile finally touched her lips, transforming her serious face. "I was beginning to wonder how long it would take you, Mr. Thorne. Mr. Harris is a good man. He is kind, and he has said many fine things to me. But he's not the man whose wagon I saw parked outside town every Thursday for the last hour of my workday." Relief washed over him, so potent it made him weak in the knees. She had seen him. She had known. "I was hoping it would be you," she said, her honesty as direct and bracing as ever. "Yes, Mr. Thorne, you may call on me." And so he did. Their courtship was as simple and sturdy as they were. He came to her small house for supper every Sunday. She was a fine cook, her meals as practical and nourishing as her conversation. They did not fill the silence with idle chatter. They spoke of things that mattered: the weather, the price of cattle, the health of a newborn calf. He learned her story in pieces. She told him about her childhood in a bustling eastern town, where her height had always made her an object of whispers and ridicule. She spoke of 7 different courtships, 7 different men who had been intrigued by her, but ultimately frightened by her stature, her competence, or her refusal to pretend to be smaller or less capable than she was. Each one had ended with a polite, flimsy excuse. "Rejected 7 times," she said, not with self-pity, but with the quiet resignation of a historian stating a fact. She had come west to Millhaven for a place where her worth might be measured differently. He, in turn, found himself speaking of Martha. He had not spoken her name to another soul in years. He told Beatrice about their life together, about the laughter that used to fill his house, about the terrible silence that had followed. He spoke of his guilt, of the feeling that he was betraying that memory by sitting here, across from another woman. Beatrice listened, her hands folded in her lap. When he was finished, she did not offer empty comforts. She simply said, "A good life does not erase another good life, Elias. It honors it by continuing." The simple wisdom of it settled his heart. They took walks along the creek that ran behind her house. They would stand on the bank, watching the water flow over the smooth stones, often without saying a word. It was in these shared silences that he felt their connection deepen most profoundly. He had spent 5 years in silence born of emptiness. This was a silence born of comfort, of a complete and trusting understanding that needed no words. He was not alone in his quiet anymore. After 3 months of Sundays and quiet walks, he knew what he had to do. He went to the old trunk at the foot of his bed, a trunk he had not opened since Martha's passing. He took out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was his mother's wedding ring, a simple band of gold, worn smooth with time. It was not fancy, but it was real. That Sunday, he met her by the creek. The autumn leaves were turning, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. He did not have a speech prepared this time. He just stood before her, the quiet rush of the water filling the air between them. He opened the box and held it out. "I'm a better man when I am with you, Beatrice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My house is just a building, but I think you could make it a home again. I would be honored if you would be my wife." She looked from the ring to his face, and her eyes were bright. She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. It was a quiet word, but it held the weight of a lifetime of waiting. Yes, Elias. I'd want that. 7 years passed. They passed in the way that good years do, marked by the rhythm of the seasons and the steady accumulation of ordinary, happy days. The house on the Thorn Ranch was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life, the laughter of 2 children, a boy with his father's steady eyes and a girl with her mother's tall, strong frame. Beatrice had brought light into the house, both literally and figuratively. One of the first things she had insisted upon was a new, large window in the kitchen, a room that had always been dark and gloomy. Elias had dutifully cut the hole in the wall and framed it, and now every morning the room was flooded with golden light. It had changed the entire feel of the house. It had changed the entire feel of his life. On a cool autumn evening, much like the one on which he had proposed, Elias stood on his front porch. He watched his wife in the yard. She was gathering laundry from a line, her movements as efficient and graceful as they had been behind the counter of the general store. Their son, Daniel, was trying to help, toddling behind her with a single sock clutched in his small fist. Beatrice bent down, her tall frame folding easily, and scooped him up, settling him on her hip without breaking her stride. A wave of gratitude, so immense it almost buckled his knees, washed over Elias. He thought of the man he had been, a ghost haunting his own life, a man sealed in the cold tomb of his past. He had been so certain that the chapter on love and happiness was finished for him. He had been so blind, so slow. He had almost missed this. The thought was a physical shock, a cold shiver that ran through him even after all these years. He had been standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss of a lonely life, and had not even known it. She had been the one to gently pull him back from the brink, not with demands or pleas, but with the simple, steady gravity of her own being. She turned then and saw him watching her. She smiled that rare, beautiful smile that was reserved only for him and their children. It was a smile that reached her eyes, making the flecks of gold in them dance. He smiled back, a true and easy smile that came to him naturally now. He had not just found a wife. He had been found by a life he never thought he would live again. It is one of life's cruelest and kindest truths that the most profound treasures are often hidden in plain sight, obscured not by some great distance or elaborate camouflage, but by the simple veil of our own expectations. We look for love in fireworks and poetry, and so we miss it in a shared silence by a creek. We search for salvation in grand gestures, and so we overlook it in the steady, capable hands of someone offering to help with a broken wheel. It is a rare and precious grace to be given a second chance to see, to truly see what was there all along, waiting patiently for you to finally get there.